The morning rays of sunlight softly touched the pristine white curtains in our bedroom. This house had always felt like a perfect picture from a magazine. A spacious living room with panoramic windows, a kitchen where I could cook all day, if only I had the interest, and a bedroom with a balcony overlooking a lush green backyard. Everything here was meant to say, "We have it all together." But in recent months, I had felt something cracking behind the shiny facade of our lives. Eric lay beside me, his face intense even in sleep. He had always been like that, collected, in control. I loved that about him when we first met, but now it felt like he was in control of everything except our marriage. Each morning began with work calls. His voice was calm, sometimes curt. Our good morning exchanges grew quieter and shorter. When he retreated to his home office, I decided to take our dog for a walk. Our golden Labrador, Daisy, was my only constant companion. We crossed the manicured lawns, passing neighborly houses painted in warm pastel tones. This neighborhood was like a stage set, every home a work of art, every path perfectly trimmed. I often thought people here tried hard not to disturb the perfection. And then I saw him. He was unloading boxes from his car, tall, tanned, with a casual ease in his stride. Noah. I would learn his name later, but at that moment, he was just a new figure in our morning landscape. I stopped so Daisy could sniff the bushes near his fence, and he noticed us. "Beautiful," he said, looking at the dog, then glancing up at me. "She walks so gracefully, as if she knows she's stunning." "It's all the compliments and treats," I replied, smiling. His lightheartedness won me over instantly. He crouched to pet Daisy. His movements were confident yet gentle, as if he was used to putting others at ease. I wanted to say something more but hesitated. It would have been strange to start a conversation with a neighbor I'd just met, but he broke the silence himself. "I'm Noah, by the way. Just moved in. Is it always this quiet around here?" "Amanda," I said, adjusting the leash. "Yes, this isn't the place where great dramas unfold." We laughed, and I immediately noticed how different his laugh was from mine. Loud, genuine. He was the complete opposite of Eric, whose reserved demeanor had become a part of who he was. On the way home, I caught myself replaying that conversation in my head. Daisy looked content, as if sensing my mood. Walking into the house, I saw that Eric had already left, leaving a coffee cup on the table. No note, no call, just a silent, "I'm busy." I wandered through the house, searching for something to fill the day, but thoughts of Noah lingered. Something about his confidence, the ease with which he spoke to me, felt so foreign to our usual world. I missed that. Simplicity, sincerity. How long would I feel like a guest in my own life? By evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard Eric come in. His footsteps were brisk as always. He nodded at me, opened his laptop, and dove into work without even sitting down to eat. I watched him from the kitchen, unable to understand why the wall between us kept growing taller. The next day, I took Daisy on another walk. Noah was there. This time, he was tossing toys for his dog, a black Labrador named Max. Their playfulness was so natural that I stopped to watch. "Want to join?" he called out when he saw me. "Your Daisy clearly has a runner's talent." We spent the morning chatting about our dogs. He turned out to be completely different from anyone I usually encountered here. Easygoing, unrestrained, as if no obligations weighed him down. When I returned home, I was surprised by how warm our conversation left me feeling. That evening, lying in bed next to Eric, I stared at the ceiling. It was as if someone had illuminated the dark corners of my life, revealing that there was more to it than I had noticed before. But what did it mean? And why did I feel it so sharply now? It was just a conversation. And yet, it felt like it meant so much more. The morning turned out to be unusually lively. I decided to stop by the small shop near our house to pick up some fresh vegetables. I had always loved this cozy little spot with its wooden shelves neatly stacked with fruits, the scent of ripe berries, and the quiet murmur of customers. It gave me a sense of simplicity that I sometimes found myself longing for. I was examining the peaches on the stand, testing them for ripeness, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Hope you know how to pick the perfect peach," Noah said, standing nearby with a basket full of groceries. His eyes sparkled with mischief, but there was also a warmth in his gaze. I smiled, trying not to show how my heartbeat had suddenly quickened. "There's a trick to it. You press lightly and feel for just the right softness. An expert, I see." He picked up a peach and mimicked my motion, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. The conversation was light, almost frivolous. We debated the best ingredients for a dinner recipe, sharing our culinary secrets. His ease was infectious. He spoke as if the world didn't demand haste, as though every moment could be savored slowly and deliberately. I realized I was standing too close to him. It wasn't intentional, but I felt his warmth, and it sent a thrill through me. The shop gradually filled with people, and the space between us seemed to shrink. We found ourselves near the bread shelf when our hands accidentally brushed. He was reaching for a loaf just as I was. "Sorry," I said, stepping back, but he didn't look away. "Don't be," he replied softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. The moment stretched on, feeling like an eternity. I could sense my breathing becoming uneven. Our eyes locked. His gaze seemed to pierce through me. The world around us seemed to fade, the chatter of customers reduced to a distant hum. Noah leaned in slightly, his face now so close to mine. I felt his breath lightly brush against my skin, and then, unexpectedly, he kissed me. It was a brief, barely there kiss, like a gentle breeze stirring loose strands of hair. I pulled away quickly, as if burned. My mind raced with panic, while my body felt frozen. Around us, life went on. Someone complained about the price of milk. The cashier called for the next customer. It all felt surreal against the backdrop of what had just happened. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not waiting for his response, and hurried out of the shop, leaving my basket behind. The air outside was fresh, but I couldn't take a full breath. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that it felt like passers-by might hear it. I walked home briskly, repeating the same thoughts in my head. What just happened? Why did I let that happen? What will he think of me? But among the whirlwind of questions, there was one thought that scared me the most. I wanted to go back. I wanted to feel him close again, hear his voice. The kiss was fleeting, yet it left an indelible mark on me that I couldn't ignore. I thought that returning home might help me collect my thoughts, but it proved impossible. Every action, even the simplest ones, seemed to drag. I caught myself staring into space, replaying his gaze, his warmth in my mind. I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my lips, even though I knew it was impossible. Eric came home late, as usual. His greeting was curt, and he didn't even look at me as he tossed his coat onto the back of a chair. I tried to talk about my day, but my words felt hollow. Even I could sense it. They didn't matter. I was still trying to rationalize what had happened. It was an accident, a misunderstanding, nothing more. But why did I find myself wanting to see Noah again? Why was I catching myself hoping for a continuation? Lying in bed, I closed my eyes, but his face filled my thoughts. His easy smile, his penetrating gaze, that fleeting moment when the world around us disappeared. I knew I should forget it, push it aside, but deep down, I already found myself yearning for another encounter. 3 days had passed. 3 long days filled with attempts not to think about what had happened. I had a simple plan: convince myself it meant nothing and move on. We had just coincidentally ended up in a small shop. The conversation lingered, and the moment, it got out of hand. A coincidence. Yes, just a coincidence. But with every passing hour, as I replayed the moment in my mind, something inside me resisted. Something whispered, this wasn't a coincidence. And the worst part was, I couldn't say I regretted it. Eric was still coming home late. He ate dinner quickly, almost silently, occasionally muttering something about work. One evening, I tried to start a conversation. Did you notice the new neighbor who moved in across the street? I asked, trying to sound casual. Yeah, I saw. Nice car. Must be another businessman, he replied, not even looking up from his laptop. Yeah, he seems friendly. I've seen him out for walks a couple of times. Eric muttered something in response, but I didn't bother to ask him to repeat it. His indifference irritated me, but the irritation was quickly replaced by guilt. After all, he didn't know. If he did, would he have said more? Or would he still be absorbed in his work? The next day, I took Daisy out for a walk again, though it was more of an excuse than a necessity. I walked our usual path, glancing occasionally toward the house across the street. Daisy wagged her tail, enthusiastically sniffing the bushes, but Noah wasn't in sight. It felt like a strange relief, yet at the same time, I was overcome by disappointment. I hated myself for these feelings. And then I heard his voice. Nice day for a walk, isn't it? Noah emerged from around the corner of the house, holding his Labrador on a leash. Max barked cheerfully when he saw Daisy. I smiled, trying not to show my nervousness. Yeah, Daisy is definitely enjoying the sunshine. We exchanged a few words as our dogs circled around us. Noah was easygoing and relaxed, as if nothing had happened, but his gaze, there was something different in his eyes. Warm but insistent, as though he was waiting for me to bring it up. How's your week been? He asked, crouching to pet Daisy. His hands, large and confident, moved slowly through her fur, but his eyes were fixed on me. Good, I replied, feeling my voice betray me with a slight tremor. How about yours? No complaints. You disappeared for a few days. I thought maybe you'd gone out of town, he said with a slight smile. No, just busy, I said, averting my gaze, trying to focus on the dogs. But my attempt to steer away from the conversation didn't work. Do you often hide, Amanda? His question caught me off guard. I felt my back stiffen. I'm not hiding, I said too quickly for it to sound convincing. Really? His voice was calm, almost lazy, but there was a pressure in that calmness. He knew what was going on with me and wasn't pretending otherwise. I exhaled, trying to regain control. Noah, it was a moment. We were both in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's better to forget about it. He nodded, but his eyes remained serious. Is that what you think? Because I can't say I regret it. My heart froze. I looked at him but couldn't respond. I couldn't say I regretted it or that it was a mistake. Instead, I pretended to focus on Daisy's leash. I think it's better if we keep our distance, I said, though the words came out with difficulty. Noah straightened and took a small step back. If that's what you want. But it's not what I want. I tugged on the leash sharply, as if trying to walk away faster. He stood there, watching me, not moving. My steps quickened, and chaos grew in my mind. His words felt like a challenge, one I was drawn to accept. When I got home, I realized I was torn between two opposing forces. One voice was loud and clear. You have to stop. Get back to normal. But the other was quiet, barely audible, and it whispered, You want this. Eric came home later than usual. He kissed me on the cheek and asked something about my day, but his question felt like a formality. I answered briefly, avoiding details. I couldn't talk. My silence was louder than any words. I lay in the darkness, listening to his steady breathing beside me. I knew he wouldn't notice if I left the room, if I wasn't next to him. But Noah noticed. He looked at me in a way no one else had in a long time, and I realized that despite my efforts to stay away from him, I was already waiting for our next meeting. The morning began with a cool breeze and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee that I poured into my thermos. Today, I wanted to escape the usual streets and change my surroundings. The forest park seemed like the perfect place. Quiet, peaceful, with only a few runners passing along the trails. Daisy wagged her tail excitedly, anticipating an adventure. The park greeted us with the sounds of nature. Birdsong and the rustle of wind in the trees filled the air with a gentle harmony. We strolled leisurely along the path, and I soaked in the tranquility until I heard a familiar voice. Crossing paths again, Amanda? Noah was walking toward me, his dog Max darting around him like a whirlwind. It seems we've become a regular sight for our dogs, I replied with a light smile, though inside I felt my heart pick up its pace. Noah came closer, his gaze as easygoing as always. Max ran over to Daisy, and they instantly started playing. Meanwhile, we continued walking together, casually chatting about random topics, weather, favorite spots in the city, even what dog breeds he'd adopt if he could. You know, he said, throwing a ball for Max, I never thought moving to the suburbs could be so pleasant. And what exactly is so pleasant about it? I asked, trying to sound innocent. The company, of course, he said, glancing at me with a look that made me feel like he could see right through me. I laughed to diffuse the tension, but then Max, overtaking Daisy, clipped her paw and splashed into a nearby puddle. Water sprayed everywhere, landing squarely on my clothes. Max! Noah exclaimed, though his tone held more amusement than scolding. I gasped, but couldn't hold back my laughter either. Water dripped from the sleeves of my sweater, and Daisy happily bounced around as if the whole situation had been her idea. Sorry about that, Noah said, trying to look apologetic, though his laughter betrayed him. Do you always carry a spare outfit? Oh, of course. I'm always prepared for surprise Labrador attacks, I joked, shaking water off my sleeve. He pulled a blanket out of his bag, spread it on a nearby grassy patch, and invited me to sit. I hesitated for a moment, but my soaked jeans left me with little choice. We sat down, and I offered him coffee from my thermos. In exchange for honesty, I'll share my coffee if you promise to keep Max away from me, I said, handing him a cup. Deal, he replied, taking it from me. Our fingers brushed slightly, and a shiver ran through me. We continued talking, but now I could feel something shifting between us. It wasn't as overt as last time. This tension was quieter, almost imperceptible. I laughed at his jokes, and he looked at me like he saw something I thought was hidden. At one point, he fell silent. I noticed how his gaze slowly shifted from my eyes to my lips. It was like an electric charge, the air between us filled with tension. You know, he began softly, you sometimes look like you're trying to hide from the world. Maybe I just like the forest, I replied, trying to turn it into a joke. Maybe, he said, his voice gentler as he inched closer. Or maybe this place gives you a chance to feel free. I wanted to respond, but the words caught in my throat. His face was too close now. I could feel the warmth of his breath, hear the soft rustling of leaves around us. My eyes lingered on his lips, and in that moment, I knew I didn't want to resist. He kissed me with such gentleness that I barely felt it. But that touch was enough to awaken everything I had tried to suppress. The kiss lasted longer than the last time. I didn't pull away, didn't try to escape. Instead, I found my hands clenching into fists, as if to keep myself grounded. When we finally broke apart, I sat there, unable to say a word. His gaze was calm, confident, yet I knew the tension in him, his own inner struggle. Should I apologize? He asked, smiling faintly. I shook my head. No. I think we both know it wouldn't change anything. Noah nodded, his gaze lingering on me a little too long. We sat in silence, listening only to the sounds of nature around us. I knew I should leave, but I didn't want to move. When I finally stood, he watched me go. I knew this moment would stay with me for a long time, but what scared me the most was that I was already looking forward to our next meeting. After that morning in the park, I realized that the line between just a neighbor and the one you think about all day was blurred. Noah became something like a shadow, following me even when he wasn't around. I caught myself replaying the memory of our kiss over and over again, like uninvited guests who refused to leave. I tried to focus on work, on Daisy, on Eric, but everything felt artificial. Every morning, I took Daisy for a walk, and every walk turned into a quiet expectation. I told myself I wasn't deliberately looking for him, but my routes, the timing of my outings, even my choice of clothing, all became calculated. I convinced myself it was all coincidence, but deep down, I knew the truth. A few days passed. I saw Noah again on the trail near our house. He was walking Max, as usual, but this time his smile was wider, his gaze more intent. "Hi, Amanda," he said, as if nothing had happened. "Hi," I replied, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the telltale warmth of a blush creeping up my cheeks. We started walking together, chatting about trivial things, about the weather, how clumsy Max was getting, even about local cafes he claimed he hadn't had the chance to try yet. But his words felt like a prelude to something more. "Hey!" he began suddenly, stopping and turning toward me. "Have you ever been to the lake north of here?" "No," I admitted. "I didn't even know there was a lake nearby." "You'd like it. It's quiet, peaceful, a perfect escape from the city." I felt his gaze linger on me just a little longer than it should have. "Maybe we could go there," he suggested. "Just for a walk. Nothing serious." I wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed that it was a bad idea, that I needed to stop this, but the words got stuck somewhere deep inside. Instead, I nodded. "Sure. When?" "Tomorrow morning. Early morning is the best time." We agreed to meet at the lake's parking lot. The next day, I woke up early, as if it were a business meeting. I spent too long choosing what to wear, trying to strike a balance between casual and "I thought about you all night." I knew how ridiculous it looked, but I couldn't help myself. When I arrived, Noah was already waiting. His black car stood alone in the empty lot, and he waved as soon as he saw me. In that moment, I felt that the day would be more than just a simple walk. "You won't regret this," he said as I got out of the car. We began walking along the shore. The lake was breathtaking. Its smooth surface mirrored the clouds, the water lapped gently against the stones, and a serene silence was broken only by birdsong. Noah walked beside me, his hands in his pockets, his steps confident, his expression relaxed. "You know," he began, "sometimes I feel like everyone in this town is trying too hard to be someone." "What do you mean?" "Everyone here wants to be successful, perfect, like their happiness depends on following a set of rules. But what if those rules weren't made for us?" I didn't know what to say. His words seemed to reach into corners of my soul I didn't want to acknowledge. We stopped at a small pier, and Noah sat on the edge, gesturing for me to join him. I hesitated, but sat down, keeping a careful distance. "I don't understand you, Noah," I said, looking out at the water. "Really?" He turned to me, his gaze almost probing. "Maybe it's because you're trying too hard to understand yourself." I sighed, feeling my words lose their weight. "Why did you ask me to come here?" "Because I want to know you. The real you, without the masks." His words caught me off guard. He said it so calmly, without reproach or expectation, but there was something in his voice I couldn't ignore. We sat in silence, staring at the lake. His hand brushed against mine by accident, and I felt my body tense, but I didn't pull away. The brief contact carried more meaning than I was ready to admit. When we returned to the parking lot, he looked at me before I got into my car. "Thanks for coming, Amanda," he said softly. "I'm not sure this was the right decision," I admitted. "Sometimes the right decisions don't bring happiness." I didn't know how to respond. As I drove away, I glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror and felt the ground beneath me start to shift. In that moment, I knew. I could no longer control this. I was sitting in the kitchen, staring at the to-do list Eric had left before his business trip. He was always meticulous: schedules, checklists, instructions. Even his approach to renovating the kitchen resembled a military operation. But I neither had the time nor the desire to handle it all on my own. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. When I opened it, there was Noah, standing with tools in hand and a slightly furrowed brow. "I figured you might need some help," he said, as if it were the most logical conclusion. "You don't even know what needs to be done," I replied, smiling as I felt a faint blush rise to my cheeks. "But I do know how to hold a hammer," he quipped with a grin, stepping inside. Noah shrugged off his jacket, and I caught myself watching him. The way he moved, his ease and confidence, filled the room with an unspoken energy. He was the complete opposite of Eric. No precision, no plans, just improvisation and living in the moment. We started with a simple task, fixing a squeaky cabinet door. His hands moved quickly and assuredly, and I felt oddly out of place in my own home. He talked about how his father had taught him to repair furniture, but I barely registered the words. My focus was entirely on the sound of his voice. Calm, steady, warm. "Hold this like that," he said, handing me a screwdriver. As I reached out, our fingers accidentally brushed. I didn't pull away immediately, and neither did he. The touch lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. Our eyes met, and suddenly, the room felt unnervingly quiet. "You're actually doing pretty well," he remarked, breaking the silence. "Maybe I'm just a secret DIY expert," I replied, trying to sound lighthearted, though my voice betrayed me. We kept working, but the atmosphere had shifted. Every movement, every glance, every word carried a weight that wasn't there before. When he handed me a tool, his hand brushed against mine again. I couldn't tell if it was intentional, but the touch sent a strange, thrilling sensation through me. "All right, almost done," Noah said, tightening the final screw. "Gotta say, you're not as helpless as you look," I laughed, shooting him a mockingly offended look. "Oh, thanks. Compliment of the year." "Just calling it like I see it," he said, his smile softening, but his eyes holding a deeper intensity. We were standing too close. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't move. He was watching me, waiting for me to make the first move, to turn away, crack a joke, say something to diffuse the moment. But I didn't do any of those things. Noah leaned in, his face so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath. His lips met mine, and I knew there was no point in resisting anymore. When the kiss ended, I stepped back, lowering my gaze. My breathing was unsteady, and my mind scrambled to find an excuse, a way to rationalize what had just happened. We should finish with the door," I managed, struggling to keep my voice even. "Of course," he replied, though his eyes betrayed something else, a quiet confidence that this wasn't over. I turned away, pretending to busy myself with organizing the tools, but the memory of the kiss refused to leave me. It was a moment I had fallen into, and I knew climbing back out would be much harder. When Noah left, the room fell into silence. I stood there, staring at the door, feeling the weight of what had just happened. This day had changed something, and it wasn't just the cabinet door. It was the beginning of something I could no longer run from. The evening was like many others in our house. Soft music, glasses of wine, and conversations that seemed to barely interest anyone present. We had invited our friends, William and his wife, Sophie, to add some variety to our routine. William was an old friend of Eric's, dating back to when they had started their business together. Sophie was kind-hearted but slightly chatty. And then there was Noah. Eric had invited him, thinking that it might be good for the new neighbor to make some connections. I felt my heart race as Noah entered the living room. He appeared relaxed, as always, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze lingered on me just a moment longer than it should have. I greeted him with a light smile, trying not to give anything away. Dinner began uneventfully. Eric was recounting a story about negotiations with some partners. Sophie chimed in with comments about her latest furniture purchase. William made jokes about it all, and Noah simply listened in silence. I stayed quiet too, feeling the tension build inside me. Hey, Amanda, William suddenly remarked, tilting his head slightly. You seem a bit out of it tonight. Is everything okay? I froze, scrambling to think of something that would sound convincing enough. Of course, just a little tired, I replied with a faint smile. Hmm, he said, glancing at Noah. Or maybe it's because of the new neighbor. You walk with Daisy so often. I'm sure you must run into each other. His words made me tense. I felt Eric's gaze slide over to me, but he just chuckled, clearly brushing it off as a joke. William, he said, shaking his head, you're still the master of making mountains out of molehills. Everyone laughed, but I couldn't relax. I sensed Noah avoiding looking in my direction, yet his presence was so palpable, it felt as though he were sitting right beside me instead of across the table. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Sophie drew Eric into a conversation about some new project. William went to fetch another bottle of wine, and I found myself alone with Noah in the kitchen. You're being awfully quiet, he remarked, leaning against the countertop. Is that a bad thing? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Number, but it draws attention. I didn't know how to respond. His words were simple, but there was something more behind them, like a warning. I should get back, I said, moving past him carefully, avoiding any contact. When the guests left, Eric began clearing the dishes. I tried to stay out of his way, but I could feel him watching me. His silence spoke volumes. Later, as I lay in bed, he sat down beside me, his phone in hand. You seemed off tonight, he said without looking at me. Just tired, I repeated, hoping it would end the conversation. You've been taking Daisy out for walks a lot lately. Does that have anything to do with our new neighbor? My hands went cold. He didn't sound accusatory, but there was persistence in his tone. I forced a smile. Eric, seriously. Daisy just loves her walks. No hidden motives, I promise. He nodded, but something in his gaze put me on edge. As I turned away and closed my eyes, I heard him unlock my phone. I knew there were no messages or calls from Noah that could betray me, but it still felt like a violation. Everything okay? I asked, not turning around. Of course, he replied curtly, placing the phone back on the nightstand. I heard him settle into his pillow, but sleep didn't come for me. I knew this wouldn't be Eric's last attempt to figure out what was going on, and the thought of how close he might come to the truth terrified me. When Noah suggested spending a day out of town, I hesitated for a long time. It seemed like a casual invitation, nothing more, but I sensed there was something deeper, more complicated behind it. Just a walk, a chance to unwind, he said with a smile. No one will know, and it'll do you good. There was no pressure in his voice, but it felt like a challenge. I said yes, even though every instinct inside me screamed that it was a bad idea. We agreed to meet in the morning at the parking lot of a small cafe. I arrived first and sat in my car, wrestling with my anxiety. I wore a simple dress and comfortable boots, trying to look casual, but my reflection in the mirror betrayed my tension. When Noah arrived, his smile immediately eased some of my worries. He stepped out of his car and waved. Hope you're ready for an adventure, he said, opening my car door. That doesn't sound like just a walk, I replied, trying to sound composed. I'm just a good guide, he said, his eyes sparkling, and I felt a warmth spreading inside me. We drove to a small town about 40 minutes away. It was quiet, free of crowds and chaos. Narrow streets lined with pastel-colored houses, little shops with Christmas-decorated windows. It all seemed too perfect, almost unreal. Let's start with a walk, Noah suggested, gesturing toward a small square surrounded by quaint stores. We wandered through shops, laughing at silly souvenirs, and talked about books in a local antique bookstore. Noah seemed completely at ease, as if he had all the time in the world, as if the day belonged to just us. This reminds me of my childhood, he suddenly said, when we stopped in front of a toy shop window. Were you the kid who was always running around and touching everything? Of course, he laughed. And you? I was too busy being good. I always had to be the responsible one. Maybe it's time to change that, don't you think? His gaze was too serious for the playful tone of his words. We had lunch in a small restaurant with wooden tables and a view of the main street. I ordered pasta. He chose steak. Our conversation drifted from our favorite travel destinations to movies we could watch over and over again. But even in this perfect moment, the voice of my conscience grew louder. I thought about Daisy waiting for me at home, about the house Eric and I had built together. I remembered how he looked at me last night, his silence saying more than words ever could. What are you thinking about? Noah suddenly leaned closer, his voice soft. That I shouldn't be here, I admitted, lowering my gaze. But you are, and that means something, doesn't it? I didn't know how to respond. He always knew how to say things that left no room for excuses. When we left the restaurant, he suggested walking through a small park nearby. The trees were bare, the air cold, but his warmth beside me made the place feel comforting. We stopped by a frozen pond, and he turned to me. Amanda, I want to be honest. This isn't just a walk for me. I don't want to pretend it doesn't mean anything. I looked at him, my breath catching. Noah, this isn't possible. It is. His voice grew firmer. It just takes time. I'm willing to wait. I turned away, staring at the ice covering the pond. His words felt like a promise, but that promise terrified me. You don't understand, I whispered. This isn't just a choice. It's my whole life. Then why are you here? His voice was quiet, without reproach or anger. I looked at him, and in that moment, everything became clear. This day had changed our relationship. It was no longer a coincidence, no longer a game. It had become something much bigger than I could allow myself to have. When he drove me back, I knew I wouldn't be able to forget this day. But what scared me most was that I didn't want to forget it. Recently, Eric had become more attentive. His glances lingered, sometimes too insistent, and I could sense he was feeling something. I tried to stay calm, to act as usual, but each day it became harder. One evening, when he returned from work, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through messages on my phone. Noah had sent a short one. Tomorrow? I quickly replied, yes. The usual time. It was just one phrase, but it held more meaning than I was ready to admit. Who's texting you? Eric suddenly asked, sitting down next to me. His tone was too even to seem casual. Just a colleague, I said, trying to sound confident, and slipped the phone into my pocket. He nodded, but his gaze remained heavy. A few minutes later, he turned his attention back to his laptop, but I knew his thoughts were still on that message. The next day, I put on a simple dress and grabbed a light jacket to head out and meet Noah. Eric was in his office, and I didn't think he'd notice my absence. Yet something in his demeanor before I left made me glance back. He looked at me too intently, his eyes silently asking, Are you sure I don't see through you? I met Noah in the park. It was quiet as always, and we walked along a secluded path by the river. The conversation was light, but there was an undercurrent in every word he spoke. I missed you, he said when we stopped under a tree. We saw each other just 2 days ago. I smiled, but my words sounded weaker than I intended. Sometimes 2 days feels like too long, he said, looking at me, his voice suddenly serious. Amanda, I can't be just your secret moment anymore. Noah, I began, but couldn't finish. He stepped closer, and I felt his hands gently touch my shoulders. His kiss was different, not as quick or impulsive as before. It carried more insistence, more emotion. I surrendered to the moment, forgetting everything that might have stopped me. But something shifted in the air. I heard the rustling of leaves and sensed how the silence around us had grown unnaturally dense. I pulled away from Noah and turned. Eric stood a short distance away, hidden in the shadows of the trees. His eyes were fixed on us. A chill ran down my spine. He said nothing, just stood there, his face calm, almost expressionless. What's wrong? Noah asked, noticing my unease. Nothing, I replied quickly, grabbing his hand. We should head back. I didn't know exactly what Eric had seen, but I was sure it was enough. When I returned home, his car was already parked in its usual spot. Inside, I found him sitting on the couch with a glass of wine. He didn't look at me, only said, "How was your walk?" "Good," I replied, trying to avoid his gaze. He took a sip of wine and remained silent. That silence was worse than any words. It burned like a red-hot blade. I knew he understood something, but said nothing. And he was waiting for me to confess on my own. That night was long. I lay beside him, listening to his steady breathing. But I knew a storm was raging inside him. And the fact that he said nothing frightened me most of all. The morning began as usual, but the air in the house was thick and heavy. Eric sat at the table with a cup of coffee, his face impassive, yet there was something unnerving behind that mask. He didn't say anything when I entered the kitchen. Even his "good morning" sounded like he didn't want to say it. I placed a cup under the coffee machine, but couldn't make myself move any further. His silence seemed to fill the entire room. My heart started pounding faster, and my hands trembled slightly. "Do you want to say something?" I finally asked, turning to him. Eric looked up. His eyes were cold as ice, yet they held a tense energy, ready to erupt. "Yes, I do," he said calmly, but every syllable felt like a blow. He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. I waited, bracing for the inevitable. "Who is he?" he finally asked. The world around me seemed to stop. His voice was quiet, but the force behind it was terrifying. "What are you talking about?" I tried to pretend I didn't understand, but my words sounded hollow. "Amanda," he sighed, sounding tired of the charade. "I saw you. I know." My body went cold. I couldn't find words, couldn't think of a way to fix this. "Do you want to explain, or should we cut to the chase?" he continued, setting his cup aside. His voice was still calm, but that calmness was menacing. "Eric, it's not what you think." But even I knew how foolish my words sounded. "Really? Then what is it?" His voice grew harder, and for the first time, he looked directly at me. I sat across from him, feeling everything inside me tighten. I wanted to explain, but how? How could I explain something I couldn't even understand myself? "It's not about you," I began, but he interrupted. "No, Amanda, it is about me, about us, about our marriage, which I thought was more than this." His words struck me, but I couldn't think of anything to say. Anything I could have come up with would only sound like a pathetic excuse. "Do you love him?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice faltered. "I don't know," I whispered, lowering my gaze. Eric stared at me for a long time. In that silence, I felt everything we had built between us crumbling. "All right," he finally said, standing up. His back was tense, his movements mechanical. "What does that mean?" I asked, feeling my hands clench into fists. "It means I'm giving you a choice, Amanda. You can go to him, or you can stay. But if you stay, I don't want lies. Not another word spoken to me in half-truths." I couldn't breathe. His words were like a hammer, but they held no anger, only the weight of disappointment and exhaustion. "And how do you imagine that?" I whispered. "If I stay, can you forgive me?" He looked at me as if that question hurt him more than anything else. "I don't know, but I want to try and see if I can ever trust you again. That, Amanda, is your choice." He walked away to his room, leaving me sitting there in silence. I felt tears streaming down my cheeks, but didn't wipe them away. All I could do was sit and stare at the empty table. His words echoed in my mind. "It's your choice." But what kind of choice was this, when either option would destroy everything I had been until this moment? I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase that was already packed. Each item inside was a symbol of my decision, one I still couldn't fully embrace. Leaving wasn't just about walking away from the house or Eric. It was abandoning a life that had once felt so right. But could I be honest with myself if I stayed? Daisy lay at my feet, her eyes filled with worry, as if she sensed the change. I stroked her head, trying to hold back my tears, but they betrayed me, streaming silently down my face. As I descended the stairs, each step felt final. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Eric was at work, and the emptiness around me only deepened the feeling that this departure was permanent. On the kitchen table, I left a note. "I've made my choice. Forgive me." I didn't know what he would feel when he read it. Perhaps anger, maybe disappointment. But I hoped, one day, he would understand. The taxi pulled up to the gate, and I loaded my suitcase into the trunk. As the car drove away, I looked back at the house through the rear window, watching it fade until it was completely out of sight. At the airport, a storm of emotions raged within me. The waiting lists, the glowing departure boards, the announcements overhead, all of it felt strangely distant. The world moved around me, but I felt like I was standing still. I checked in, avoiding thoughts of what I'd left behind. My flight was in an hour, so I sat by one of the large windows, watching planes take off and land. It was supposed to be calming, but instead, I felt more lost than ever. I took out my phone to write to Noah, but my fingers froze. I didn't know what to say. He was waiting for me, unaware of the storm inside me. At that moment, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Eric. "I still love you, your choice." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. His words were simple, but they held everything: his pain, his hope, and his willingness to let me go if that was what I truly wanted. The world around me suddenly became too loud. I stood up, unsure of where to go, and walked toward the departure board. The glow from the screens illuminated my face, reflecting my inner turmoil. I stood there, looking at the destination I'd chosen. But now, that choice felt almost impossible. What if I was making a mistake? What if I was only making everything worse? My breathing grew uneven. My throat tightened as if all the air had been sucked out of the terminal. My heart pounded, and my mind wrestled between the past and the future. It felt as though a camera had zoomed in on my face, capturing the full spectrum of my emotions: guilt, love, fear, and, buried somewhere deep, a hope for freedom. But the decision I had to make was mine alone. And in that moment, I realized, whatever I chose, I would never be the same again.